Who let her speak? The laughter came sharp and easy, cutting across the glass-walled boardroom as if it belonged there, as if everything did. Heads tilted, a few smirks followed, and somewhere near the end of the polished 12-foot table, a pen tapped once, then stopped. Ava Johnson didn't move. Not when the laughter lingered. Not when someone shifted in their leather chair and whispered something she couldn't hear but didn't need to. She stood there in a borrowed blazer that didn't quite fit her shoulders, badge clipped slightly crooked at her waist, the faint hum of the overhead lights buzzing just loud enough to fill the silence that followed. The skyline behind them stretched wide and distant, sunlight reflecting off steel and glass, but inside this room, everything felt colder. Richard Coleman leaned back in his chair like he owned not just the company, but the air itself. His cufflinks caught the light as he folded his hands, eyes narrowing with amused disbelief. "We're in the middle of a multi-million-dollar decision," he said, voice calm, almost entertained. "This isn't a place for guesses." A few quiet chuckles followed. Ava inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that steadies something deeper than nerves. Her fingers brushed the edge of the document in front of her, paper thick, expensive, printed in clean legal type. She had seen this before. Not here, not like this, but close enough that her chest tightened in recognition. The words, the structure, the quiet trap buried in language designed to sound safe. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips now, but her voice, when it came, didn't shake. "It's not a guess," she said. Not loud, not forced, just steady enough to land. That shifted something. Not much, just enough for a few heads to turn. Richard's smile didn't fade, but it paused, like it had to decide whether to stay. "Then enlighten us," he replied, gesturing lazily toward the paper, as if indulging a moment that would pass. Ava stepped forward, just one step, the soft sound of her shoes against the floor almost lost under the low hum of the room. "Clause 14b, she said, pointing, her finger stopping just above the line. "It transfers post-merger liability entirely to your side. If anything fails, compliance, lawsuits, regulatory breaches, you absorb all of it." A beat, then another. Someone shifted again, this time not laughing. Richard's eyes dropped to the page, just briefly, then lifted again, expression unreadable. "That's standard language," he said. But the certainty wasn't as clean as before. Ava didn't look away. "No, sir," she answered quietly. "It's disguised to look standard." The room didn't laugh this time. It held, like something unseen had just entered and no one knew yet what it meant. Ava swallowed once, her throat tight, but her posture unbroken. "It's the same clause," she continued, softer now, but somehow heavier. "The same structure that collapsed a company 10 years ago." Richard's fingers stilled on the table. Just for a second. Almost nothing. But enough. Ava's gaze didn't leave him. "You signed that one too." The silence did not break all at once. It stretched. Thin and fragile, like glass under pressure, and Ava could feel every eye in the room shifting toward her now, not with laughter, but with something slower, heavier, uncertainty settling into the spaces where confidence had been just seconds ago. And across the table Richard Coleman leaned forward slightly, his fingers no longer relaxed, resting flat against the polished surface as if grounding himself in something solid, his gaze fixed on her with a new sharpness, not amused now, not dismissive, but searching, calculating. "That is a serious claim," he said, his voice quieter, controlled, and the room followed his tone, no one daring to interrupt. A senior analyst to his right reached for the document, flipping quickly, then slower, scanning line by line as if the words had suddenly changed shape. Ava remained still, her posture straight, her hands no longer trembling, because she had crossed the point where fear mattered. "It is not a claim," she replied, steady. "It is a pattern," and that word landed differently. It did not accuse, it revealed, and that was what made it dangerous. Richard's jaw tightened just slightly, almost invisible, but enough. "Explain," he said, and this time it was not a command, it was a need. Ava exhaled softly, her eyes dropping to the page for just a second before lifting again. The language mirrors a liability inversion structure used in a case 10 years ago. The phrasing is adjusted, the terms are softened, but the outcome is identical. The acquiring party assumes full exposure while the originating firm retains operational escape. She paused, not for effect, but because memory had weight, and it pressed against her chest now. That company collapsed within 18 months, she added, and someone at the far end of the table shifted sharply, the faint scrape of a chair echoing louder than it should have. Richard's eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second, recognition brushing against something buried. "You are suggesting we are being set up," he said, slower now, and Ava shook her head once, small but certain. "I am saying it has already been done before." The analyst beside him stopped turning pages, his hand frozen midair, eyes locked on a paragraph. Then he looked up, hesitation written clearly across his face. "Sir," he said carefully, "there is a clause here that does shift disproportionate liability." And the room changed again, not dramatically, but enough that the air felt different, heavier, real. Richard did not respond immediately, his gaze still on Ava, as if trying to place her, not just in the room, but somewhere further back, somewhere he could not quite reach. "And how would you know this?" he asked finally. And this time there was no laughter left in the question, only something quieter, something closer to doubt. Ava held his gaze, and for the first time there was something visible in her eyes, not anger, not fear, but something deeper, something carried for years. "Because I watched what it did," she said, her voice softer now, but stronger for it. Not from a boardroom, but from the other side of it. And the words did not rise. They settled, and in that moment, no one in the room moved, no one spoke, because whatever came next was no longer just about a contract. It was about something none of them had expected to face. The air in the room shifted again, slower this time, like something heavy settling into place, and Ava could feel it pressing against every surface, against the glass walls, against the polished table, against the silence that no one seemed willing to break. Richard leaned back slightly, but it was not the same relaxed posture from before. His shoulders held tension now, controlled, deliberate, as if every movement had to be measured. "What happened to that company?" he asked. And the question did not sound like curiosity. It sounded like something personal trying not to surface. Ava did not answer right away. Her eyes drifted for a brief second to the window behind him, where the city stretched endlessly, bright and distant, before returning to him, steady, grounded. "It did not fail overnight," she said quietly. "It unraveled slowly. Contracts collapsed, partners pulled out, lawsuits followed, and by the time anyone realized what had happened, there was nothing left to save." A faint shift ran through the room. Someone exhaled under their breath. Another executive leaned forward, elbows on the table, no longer pretending this was routine. Richard's fingers tapped once against the surface, then stopped again, his gaze narrowing. "And you were involved in that case," he said. But there was something off in the way he said it, like he already knew the answer did not fit the question. Ava shook her head slightly. "No, sir," she replied, and her voice softened, not weaker, but deeper. "My father was." The words did not echo, they settled, and for the first time the room felt smaller, closer, as if the distance between power and consequence had just been erased. Richard's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough that the shift could be felt more than seen, a flicker of something human breaking through the control. "What was his role?" he asked, quieter now, and Ava's hands came together loosely in front of her, fingers interlacing as if holding on to something unseen. "He worked in operations," she said. "He was not in rooms like this. He trusted the decisions made here. He believed the structure would protect the people beneath it." She paused, and for a moment her voice almost caught, but she held it steady. "It did not," the analyst across the table lowered his gaze back to the document, scanning again, more urgently now, flipping to another section, then another, as if trying to confirm what he did not want to admit. "There are multiple references here," he said, his tone tighter. "Cross-liability triggers, hidden in conditional language." Another executive leaned in. "That is not standard," he muttered, and the room began to move. Not with noise, but with awareness, quiet, focused, undeniable. Richard did not look at them. His eyes stayed on Ava, searching, tracing something he could not fully place. "And your father," he said slowly. "What happened to him after that collapse?" The question hung there, heavier than anything before, and Ava did not look away, not this time, not at all. "He lost everything," she said, calm, but the weight behind the words was unmistakable. His job, his savings, his health over time. Because stress does not disappear when the headlines fade. She inhaled once, steady, controlled. He spent years trying to understand how something signed in a room like this could reach all the way down to someone like him. Silence followed, deeper than before, not empty, but full, and Richard's gaze finally dropped, not to the document, not to the table, but somewhere in between, as if the past had just stepped into the room and refused to leave. And for the first time since this meeting began, he did not have an immediate answer. The silence did not ease, it deepened, stretching across the length of the table until even the quiet hum of the overhead lights felt louder than it should, and Ava could sense it now. Not just attention, but weight, the kind that presses on people when something undeniable begins to surface. Richard remained still for a moment longer, his gaze lowered, his reflection faintly visible in the polished table. And when he finally looked up again, something had shifted in his eyes, not fully understood yet, but no longer shielded by confidence alone. "You are asking me to believe that this situation is identical," he said, measured, careful, as if choosing each word mattered now. And Ava did not rush to answer. She let the moment settle, let the room feel the gravity before she spoke. "I am asking you to look," she replied, her voice calm, steady, grounded in something deeper than emotion, and she gently turned the document toward him, sliding it across the surface just a few inches, the paper making a soft sound that seemed louder than it was. Richard's hand hovered over it for a second before resting flat, his fingers pressing lightly against the page, not yet turning it, just feeling its presence, as if it carried more than ink. Across the table, the analyst leaned forward again, flipping to another section, his movements quicker now, less controlled. "There are mirrored structures in sections 16 and 19 as well," he said, his voice tightening. "Conditional reversals, hidden triggers." Another executive shook his head slowly. "This is not an oversight," he muttered, and that word, oversight, did not belong anymore. Not here, not now. Richard finally turned the page, his eyes scanning, slower this time, not skimming, not assuming, actually reading, and the room watched him. Every movement, every pause, because the answer no longer belonged to Ava alone. It was unfolding in front of all of them. Ava remained standing, her hands now resting lightly at her sides, her shoulders relaxed, not because the tension was gone, but because she had already carried it for too long to let it break her now. "Why speak up now?" Richard asked without looking up, his voice quieter than before, almost reflective, and Ava's eyes softened just slightly. "Not in weakness, but in honesty, because no one did then," she said, and the words did not accuse. They revealed. They filled the room in a way no argument could. Richard's eyes paused on a line, his brow tightening just a fraction, and then he stopped moving altogether. The pen beside his hand rolled slightly, then settled, unnoticed, and across from him the analyst lowered his voice, almost to a whisper. "Sir, if this executes the way it is written, we assume full exposure across all post-merger liabilities." No one spoke after that. Not immediately, because the meaning was clear, too clear, and Richard slowly leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. Beneath him, his gaze lifting from the document to Ava, not with disbelief now, not with dismissal, but with something heavier, something closer to realization. 10 years ago, he said slowly, almost to himself, we were told it was an isolated failure. Ava did not interrupt. She did not need to, because the truth was already moving, already connecting pieces he had not been forced to see before. And in that moment, the distance between the man at the head of the table and the girl who had just spoken began to collapse, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, as if the room itself had shifted its balance, and there was no returning to where it had been just minutes before. The room did not return to normal. It could not. Something had already shifted too far, and Ava could feel it in the way no one interrupted anymore. No one leaned back comfortably. No one pretended this was routine. Even the city outside seemed distant now, muted behind the glass as if the world itself had stepped back to watch what would happen next. Richard remained seated, but his posture had changed, no longer relaxed, no longer certain, his shoulders slightly forward, his attention fully locked on the document in front of him. and then on Ava, as if moving between the two was the only way to understand what was unfolding. Who drafted this agreement? He asked, his voice controlled but carrying an edge that had not been there before. One of the senior executives cleared his throat, hesitating just long enough to reveal discomfort before answering. It came from Vaughn Legal Partners, sir. Reviewed internally but not flagged. The words sounded smaller than they should have, like they no longer held authority in this room. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, his fingers pressing into the edge of the paper, not enough to crease it, just enough to show the tension beneath the surface. Not flagged. He repeated, slower, as if testing the weight of the phrase, and then his gaze shifted back to Ava, sharper now, searching for something deeper than what had already been said. And you recognized this immediately, he said. And it was not disbelief anymore, it was something closer to realization. Ava did not look away, her voice steady, grounded. Not immediately, she answered. But the structure felt familiar, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The analyst across the table nodded slightly without realizing it, his eyes still scanning the document, tracing the same pattern she had pointed out, and another executive leaned forward, voice lower now, cautious. If this goes through, we could be exposed across multiple jurisdictions, regulatory and civil. No one dismissed him. No one laughed, because the risk was no longer theoretical. It was present, sitting on the table in front of them. Richard exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but enough to mark a shift. His hand moved to the pen beside him, lifting it for a second before placing it back down without writing. And that small action carried more weight than anything he had said so far, because it meant hesitation. It meant reconsideration, something that had not existed when this meeting began. Ava watched him quietly, not with expectation, not with demand, just with the calm certainty of someone who had already spoken her truth and was no longer trying to prove it. You said your father trusted decisions made in rooms like this, Richard said, his voice quieter now, almost reflective, and Ava nodded once, slowly. He believed the system would protect the people who depended on it, she replied. And the simplicity of that statement made it heavier, not lighter, because it exposed something beyond contracts and clauses, something about responsibility that could not be rewritten or negotiated. The room fell into another silence. But this one felt different, not tense, not uncertain, but heavy with understanding, and Richard finally leaned back, his gaze moving from Ava to the executives around the table, taking in their expressions, their unease, their realization, before returning to her. And what would you do? He asked. And this time it was not a challenge, it was a question he genuinely needed answered. Ava paused for just a moment, not because she did not know, but because she understood what the answer meant. I would stop this before it becomes another story someone has to carry for 10 years, she said, her voice calm, unwavering, and the words settled into the room like something final, something that could not be ignored, and for a long second, no one moved, because the decision no longer felt like a business choice. It felt like a moral one, and Richard knew it. The room did not rush forward. It slowed, as if time itself had decided to pause and let every word settle fully before anything else could happen. And Ava could feel that stillness wrap around her, not as pressure, but as space, the kind she had not been given before, the kind where truth could exist without being interrupted. Richard sat there with the document in front of him, but he was no longer reading it. His eyes rested somewhere beyond the page, beyond the table, as if he was looking through layers of memory he had not revisited in years, and the faint reflection of the skyline in the glass behind him flickered softly as clouds shifted outside, changing the light in the room from sharp brightness to something more muted, more reflective. His hand moved slowly, not toward the pen this time, but toward the edge of the document, his fingers tracing the paper lightly, as if confirming its reality, and then he let go, leaning back into his chair with a quiet exhale that seemed to carry more than just the moment. 10 years, he said, almost under his breath, not addressing anyone directly, but the words still reached every corner of the room. Ava remained where she was, her posture steady, her presence calm, not pushing, not retreating, simply allowing the silence to do its work, because this was not a moment that could be forced. Across the table, the analyst closed the document slowly, not with certainty, but with recognition, as if the act of closing it acknowledged. Something had already been decided. One of the executives shifted in his seat, glancing briefly at Richard, then backed down, unsure whether to speak or remain silent, and that uncertainty spoke louder than any interruption could have. The room was no longer controlled by hierarchy. It was held by truth, and that changed everything. Richard's gaze lifted again, finding Ava not as a challenge, not as an obstacle, but as a presence he could no longer dismiss. And when he spoke, his voice had lost the sharp edge it once carried, replaced by something quieter, more deliberate. "You said you are not here for revenge," he said, and Ava nodded once, slowly, her eyes steady. "I am not," she replied, her voice soft but unwavering. "I am here because it should not happen again." And the simplicity of that statement filled the space in a way no argument ever could. Richard held her gaze for a long second, and something in his expression shifted again, not visibly dramatic, but deeply felt, as if a line had been crossed inside him, not by force, but by understanding. Outside the window, a faint breeze moved across the skyline, barely noticeable, but enough to ripple the light against the glass. And inside the room, the tension that had once been sharp now felt different, not gone, but transformed, no longer defensive, no longer dismissive, but reflective. And Richard's hand returned to the table, resting flat, no longer gripping, no longer resisting, just present, as if he had finally stopped holding on to something he could not justify anymore. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to argue. And in that quiet, in that suspended moment between decision and action, the weight of what had been said settled fully, not as accusation, but as truth that demanded to be acknowledged. And for the first time since the meeting began, the room did not feel like a place of power. It felt like a place of reckoning. Richard did not move immediately, but something had already shifted beyond hesitation, beyond reflection, into something final, something that could no longer be delayed. His eyes dropped once more to the document in front of him, not scanning now, not analyzing, but confirming what he already understood, and then his hand reached for the pen again. This time without uncertainty, without pause. The room held its breath, not because they expected him to sign, but because they no longer knew what he would do. And that uncertainty carried weight, real weight. His fingers wrapped around the pen, lifting it slowly, the soft click against the table echoing louder than it should have. And for a brief second, it looked like the moment could go either way, like everything that had been said might still be ignored, still be set aside. But then he placed the pen down, not on the signature line, not near the document, but several inches away from it, deliberate, unmistakable, and the shift was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. One of the executives exhaled sharply without realizing it. Another leaned back slightly, tension releasing in a way that had been building since the beginning of the meeting. The analyst closed his folder fully now, no hesitation left in the motion, because the decision had already been made. Richard leaned forward, both hands resting flat on the table, his gaze moving slowly across the room, meeting each pair of eyes, not as a figure of authority now, but as someone acknowledging responsibility. And when he spoke, his voice was steady, but different, stripped of the distance it once carried. "This agreement will not move forward," he said, and no one questioned it, no one challenged it, because the truth behind it had already been laid bare. And then his attention returned to Ava, not briefly, not in passing, but fully, directly. "You prevented something we did not see," he said, and the words were not casual, not polite, they were grounded in recognition. Ava did not respond right away, she simply held his gaze, her expression calm, not seeking acknowledgement, not demanding it, just present in the moment. She had created. Richard's posture shifted again, less rigid now, more open, as if the weight he had been holding had finally settled into understanding. 10 years ago, he continued, quieter now. "We told ourselves it was a mistake we could not have predicted." He paused, the room listening, not out of obligation, but because something real was being said. But today proves that is not entirely true. The words did not sound like an excuse, they sounded like acceptance, and that difference changed everything. One of the executives nodded slightly, not to agree, but to acknowledge. The analyst kept his eyes lowered, absorbing what had just been admitted, and Ava finally spoke, her voice soft. Steady. What matters is what you do once you see it, she said, and the simplicity of her words carried more weight than anything complex could have. Richard nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in understanding, and for a moment, no one moved, because the realization had already settled across the room, not as pressure, but as clarity, and in that clarity, something had shifted permanently, not just a decision, but a perspective, one that could not easily return to what it had been before, and as the light outside shifted again, reflecting softly across the glass walls, the room no longer felt like a place of dominance or hierarchy. It felt like a place where truth had changed the outcome, quietly, but completely. No one rushed to speak after that, not because they had nothing to say, but because the moment had already said everything for them, and Ava could feel it in the way the room held still, not tense anymore, not guarded, just quiet in a way that felt earned. Richard remained seated for a few seconds longer, his hands resting on the table as if grounding himself in the decision he had just made, and then slowly, he stood, the movement deliberate, measured, drawing the attention of everyone without. A single word, his chair slid back with a soft sound that echoed faintly in the silence, and when he looked at Ava again, there was no distance left in his expression, no trace of the earlier dismissal, only something quieter, something closer to recognition. You could have stayed silent, he said, his voice calm, not loud, but carrying clearly across the room. Ava did not respond immediately, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, because she understood what the moment meant, not just for her, but for everything that had led here. It would have been easier, Richard continued, almost to himself, and then he paused, as if choosing what came next carefully. But you did not. Ava let out a small breath, not visible to anyone else, but enough to release something she had been holding since she first stepped into the room. Silence is easier, she said quietly, but it does not fix anything. And the simplicity of her words settled into the space between them, not challenging, not accusing, just true. Richard nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something beyond the conversation itself, and then he glanced briefly at the document, still lying untouched on the table, before looking back at her. What happened to your father? He asked, and this time the question carried no distance, no authority, only a quiet need to understand. Ava's expression softened just slightly, not with sadness alone, but with acceptance. He kept working, she said, her voice steady. He took smaller jobs, did what he could to hold things together. He never blamed anyone directly, but he never trusted decisions like this again. She paused, her eyes lowering for just a second before lifting again. He believed people in rooms like this would eventually see what they were doing. The words did not accuse, they honored, and that difference mattered. Richard absorbed that quietly, his gaze steady, his posture no longer rigid. And today, he said, almost under his breath, we did. Ava did not smile. She did not react beyond a small, almost invisible nod, because this was not a moment for celebration. It was a moment for understanding, and the room reflected that. One of the executives shifted slightly, looking down at the table. Another closed his folder completely, as if acknowledging the finality of the decision. And Richard took a step away from the head of the table, not toward the exit, but slightly to the side, breaking the invisible line that had once defined his position. And in that subtle movement, something changed again, something quiet but powerful, because for the first time, he was no longer standing above the room. He was standing within it. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that shift with it. Thank you, he said, simple, direct, without formality, without distance. And Ava met his gaze, not with surprise, not with relief, but with calm acceptance, because she had not come here for those words. She had come here for something far more important, and now that it had happened, the room no longer felt like a place she did not belong. It felt like a place that had finally learned how to listen. The meeting did not end with applause or sudden movement. It dissolved quietly, like tension releasing from a space that no longer needed to hold it. Chairs shifted back one by one. Papers were gathered with softer hands, and voices, when they returned, stayed low, measured, as if something in the room had taught them restraint. Ava did not move immediately. She stood for a moment longer near the edge of the table, her fingers lightly brushing the surface where the contract still lay unsigned, untouched, and for a brief second she allowed herself to feel it. Not victory, not relief, but something steadier, something that settled deeper than either of those. Across the room, Richard remained standing as well, speaking quietly with one of the executives. But his voice no longer carried the same authority it once had. It carried intention now, careful, deliberate, and that difference was enough to change everything. Ava turned slightly toward the glass wall, the city stretching out beyond it, endless and bright, the sunlight reflecting off distant buildings in a way that made everything feel both vast and quiet at the same time. And in that reflection she caught a glimpse of herself, small against the skyline, but no longer invisible, no longer overlooked, just present, fully and undeniably. Behind her footsteps approached, steady but unhurried, and she did not need to turn to know who it was. Richard stopped a few feet away, not too close, not distant either, just enough to be heard. Without imposing, "We will be reviewing every contract moving forward," he said, his voice calm, almost reflective, and Ava nodded once, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, because the words mattered less than the understanding behind them. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, not forced, just quiet, and then he added, "What you said today will stay with this company." Ava let out a small breath, her eyes still on the city. "It should stay with the people in it," she replied softly, and that was all. No more needed to be said. Richard nodded, once, slowly, and then stepped back, not turning immediately, as if allowing the moment to settle fully before leaving it behind. Ava remained by the glass a moment longer, the faint hum of the building surrounding her, the soft